I mentioned in my introduction to the book Solar Plexus, The History of the World, that I wanted to talk about the Christian legacy. So to truly explain the Christian legacy, we have to start here with Moses, and he's holding the tablets of the law, and that represents the Jewish legacy, but out of which came the Christian legacy, and out of which also came the Islamic religion. So, starting with Moses, there was a schism in the Eastern and the Western churches. Here we have the original Christian church by a Christian emperor, who I'll show in one of the pages that come after this. And he built this massive building called Hagia Sophia, which was against the Roman civilization. They tried to design a building that didn't look anything like the Romans at all. And ironically, by the 1400s, the Turkish Empire took over and conquered Istanbul, and this very great church, which was the biggest building ever made, with this huge cavernous center with no columns in it. It was a great big empty circular space, and this was a great achievement. It became the model of the Islamic mosques after this period. And this was set up in the city called Constantinople by Constantine. And from this church, the expansion into the future went into Russia, which was a huge territory. And the Russian Orthodox Church came out of this church, which was called the Orthodox Christian Church. Here on the other side, we see the Catholic Church, which claimed the Roman legacy and built it on a massive scale, because at this point in history the Catholics were aware, due to all the expansion and the exploration of the planet, that the Catholic Church had become the center of an international church, a world church. So here's a barrel vault of the Romans, and then this vast crowd of people who belonged to the Catholic Church. North of the Alps, this was in Rome, in Italy, north of the Alps the Gothic tradition flourished, which is the pointed arches. And what's shown here is the dramatic moment when the soldiers, under orders of the king, came in to kill the Archbishop of Canterbury. So this is what created the Canterbury Tales by William Chaucer. And here I put an ordinary little church way into the future, which you'll see in any town, anywhere. One of these churches with a steeple and the congregation in the hall. And right down below, South Africa, there's a tiny little building behind this person's head, peeping through a window and not even knowing this grand past that brought about Christianity into the 20th century, where they know it. And over here, right in the corner, I've got a little Greek temple, which is the temple of truth from the god of Apollo. That is what was the navel of Greece. This is the grand saying that the Greeks had to tell the truth. We call them pagans, but they were not free of having to tell the truth. So that just gives you an overview of the way, the way Christianity evolved into the future. This is the central truth of what Christianity means. There can't be a Christian church which doesn't serve the bread and the wine, which is what Jesus said to do before he was taken off to be crucified. If you don't have this ceremony, it won't be a Christian church. And so the irony is that there's so many Christian churches with so many different dogmas, you wouldn't believe it was the same Messiah that they're all believing in. Ironically, Jesus claimed that he was the bread and the wine. The bread represents the first son of man, who was Cain. He was the wheat farmer, and his brother was Abel, who Cain murdered. And that's what represents the wine in the chalice. Otherwise there would have been a lamb there. But Jesus was also called the Lamb of God. And he made this promise that he will return. And so that's where the expectation to watch out for Jesus came from. Here he is, as the Gothic world portrayed Jesus. On the one side you have Peter, who was an actual disciple of Jesus, who became an apostle. And Jesus said, "Peter, on you will I found my church." That is why in the Vatican they call the main church there St. Peter's. And Peter was in charge of the gate of heaven. That's why he held the key. On the other side, you see Paul. He was a lawyer. And he was the one that set out the laws. And he invented theology. And he was the one who traveled from Jerusalem in Israel, Palestine. He traveled to all the main cities around the Mediterranean, and in that way Christianity started being spread into the world. Here is a rather complicated picture, but I love condensing complex information into one single image. In the front and right and left, you have the very first Roman emperor. His name was Augustus, and the very last Roman emperor, who was called Diocletian. The first Roman emperor, his system of government was called the Principate, and he called himself the first among the equals. He didn't put himself above the other Roman families. But because he was the emperor, his family, the people who came after him, began to start claiming that they were actually identical with God, because they were in that position of authority. On the other side, above Augustus, are the Western kings, Charlemagne, Otto, Charles V, Elizabeth I of England. It is through these monarchs and through him that the democratic tradition came into the Western world. Democracy on this side did not happen into the Russian world. They still are suspicious of the whole idea of power to the people. But Diocletian modeled himself on the Persian kings, and he called himself Sacrus Dominum, the sacred lord, and his government was called the Dominate. And he followed the Persian model of the monarch. He used to have his throne up a little flight of stairs, and down below there were two panthers, one on each side. So, of course, there was no danger of assassination, because you'd have to get past those panthers to get up to the emperor. So the vision of the emperor in the Russian Orthodox world is very remote, far removed from the people. And the kings that modeled themselves on him was Ivan the Terrible. Peter the Great made an attempt to bring the Western world into Russia, and of course Catherine the Great, who in her youth entertained Voltaire and the people of the 18th century, but she soon changed that when the French Revolution came about. So that became the Russian, the Orthodox tradition, and this is the classical tradition where the Catholics claimed the Roman legacy, and hence you see all the classical buildings, post offices, the capital of America is all Roman, based on the Roman. And what happened was, when Constantine, this is the Arch of Constantine, he was the first Roman emperor to say, "I am a Christian," and he conquered both sides, the East and the West Empire, and he called the church together, all the people from the different Alexandria and Corinth, all the churches around the world had to come together for a conclave, and he was looking to see if there was any form of unity in the Christian religion. And once all the bishops got together, this huge dispute came about between this man called Athanasius and Arius. Arius didn't believe Jesus was divine. He believed he was a man and that he suffered more in the line of a prophet. But Athanasius believed in the Trinity, in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And the schism in the church happened through this conclave, where the Orthodox Church went that way, and Rome was founded. Why? Because you see in the middle of the arch here, there's a coin. This is a Roman coin, and it shows the head of Nero, who was one of the most grandiose of all the emperors, and the persecution of Christians was at its climax under him. So because of all the martyrs and because of the hundreds of deaths of Christians in the arena, the Pope thought it's best that Rome should be the capital city of the Christian empire, the Christian world. So up till this point, the only place for the Christians to meet was in the catacombs down below the surface of the earth. And here we see all the Christians and the corpses together, and their only exit was into the arena. So Constantine came along and Christians began to have a sort of relief. After Constantine, here comes Justinian, and he's the emperor that built this new church that I showed you in the first picture, Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, which means sacred wisdom. He built that church. And then Theodosius came after him, and he invented the civil code, which set up what we know today as the medieval world, where if you were born a peasant, you remained a peasant. There was no, it sort of froze society in a given pattern. So the king would be born the king, his son would be the king, and so on. And right at the top here, we see the double-headed eagle, which is very popular in the Western world because at the time it represented the eagle looking to the Eastern Empire, which became the Orthodox Church, and the Western Empire. So the crown is on the two heads of the eagles looking east and west. So this picture is called the Christian Legacy. I hope it wasn't too much for your mind, but being on one page, I think it's easier to understand the global picture of what really happened. Here we see the structure of authority. One of the popes put a crown on the head of a king called Charlemagne and created what he called the Holy Roman Empire, which gave the king the right to have the whole tradition of civitas, the civic life, and prefects, and gathering taxes and dividing the land up. And in his hand he's got the scepter, and in the Pope's hand is the what do you call that thing, the crook, which was used by shepherds to pull sheep in and keep them together. So he's got the crook in his one hand and the Bible in his other hand, and behind him are all the monks and the bishops and the archbishops, and their task is to guard the past, because all the knowledge that gave him authority came from the past into the present. So he felt, because he had the word of God, that he was above the king. And this was the beginning of the dispute between the absolute power of the Pope and the absolute power of the king. Behind the king, you see all the people who obeyed him. So the soldier and the monk were the equal counterparts, but each working for a different authority. So who is the soldier guarding? He's guarding the woman. And what has the woman got? She is the way to the future, because through her is born the new ages that will follow. So this is the structure of society, and the Pope rose to power, and his power got so great it was found out it became corrupt, as Martin Luther was to point out, and then the schism between the authority of the Pope and the authority of the king brought about the Protestant Revolution, which will be in the next set of pictures. This set is just to explain what the medieval world was all about. Here we see the status of the king. His throne's on a chessboard, and he was the negotiator and the activation factor for the world, ruling the world. Here's the scepter, here's the globe, which represented the world, and he had the knowledge of what, and so he was in charge. Woman represented the earth, that is, territory. A woman was forced to marry someone, and her country became under the power of her husband. So this is the old system where the man is the boss and the woman is just there to give birth. And this is an old Spanish image of Madonna and Child, way before the Renaissance. Here the king is with the sword drawn, riding out into the kingdom, and he has the authority of the world at his disposal. Here was a very big day in the history of the church and the king. Henry II, the king, got so mad at Thomas à Becket, that Archbishop of Canterbury, he said, "Oh, who will rid me of this priest?" Which his soldiers took to be, "Go and kill the Archbishop of Canterbury." So this servant and this servant, he wasn't allowed to have a sword, so these soldiers came into the cathedral and murdered the Archbishop. And that made Canterbury become a shrine, and Geoffrey Chaucer commemorated this event in the pilgrimage. Real Christians went in the springtime, they rode to Canterbury, and on the way they told stories of their journey. So this was a big event. Does this mean the king's bad, or does this mean the Pope's the boss? Here comes the dispute, the first sign of the real big dispute. This picture, there's only 2 more to go. This image shows all the employment and the jobs that were given to women in those days. The queen was empowered because the king put the crown on her head. And if you look from his palace, he looked out of that window towards the New World, as it was called, and there the ships are. And out of that window he looked into the mainland, which is all the realm of the peasants. So there's the peasant woman and the queen. And if you look over here, the man who was interested in science was called the alchemist, and his counterpart was the botanist, but later on she was called the witch. She was the one, she wasn't married, she would go out into the country and look for herbs and things. So they were both dealing with chemistry, she through nature and he through chemicals. Down below here you see the monk and the nun. That was another job. Down here on the right, a girl could be a maid in a house, or she rose up to become a housefrau, and she had to serve her husband's will. And then up top here, the innkeeper's wife, and there's the prostitute, which she would be killed if she was ever caught. But there's the prostitute. So, looking at the story of Jesus, he came from this place, from peasant stock, into the city. Here's the inn. He was laid in the manger over here. And what I've got on these 2 towers above the entrance of the city is the merchant holding up the coin, pointing to liberty, and there's the cooking pot and the coin on the tower. He believed that was the main point of life, is the money and the food. And he held up the cross, and he points to the bell, which the saying was, "Do not ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee," means we are all going to die. So it's more important to worry about your pedigree than to care about your worldly status. So here between the 2 you see the chess set, which could be played from front to back or from side to side. And there's the deaths of all the knights and the kings who passed away from history. Totally dramatic. But anyway, that was about women. And this last picture shows the way of life, daily life for a peasant. Here's the peasant's little house, which is literally woven sticks and mud. And then ploughing the field, sowing, reaping. There it is growing. Ploughing, sowing, reaping. That's all he was allowed to be and do. And all his harvest most of it was claimed by the Lord. And there's the Lord riding out on his horse with his hawk to show I have control over the wilder elements of nature. And there's the hunter in his forest. All his animals were in the forest. On this side we see life in the town, which is really where the modern age came from. There you see the stonemason, the cathedral builder. Here's the builder of ordinary buildings, bricks, climbing up the ladder. and behind the bricks there the loaves of bread from the baker. Here you see the ship, and there's a crane, so all the goods coming in from the New World were being sold in these shops here on the ground floor. And the first universities were on the first floor above the shop. That's where universities come from. And then above that were rented spaces. Here we see the explorer with his compass and his measuring. What's this thing called? It's not a compass, it's the other one, divider. In the top here we see the Duke and the Archbishop collecting taxes from the people. Everybody had to pay. And anybody who breaks the law was executed in public. And so behind this wheel, they used to put a wheel on a pole and hang people on, and then the birds would peck their eyes out and eat them while they rotted up there. Here you see the stocks. And there they are being accused. Man and woman is reduced to pathos under all these powers. You can see why they had to try and get self-rule eventually. We couldn't have gone on and on eternally under the power of these more uncaring forces. And then this side you see the three bad monks, the corrupt ones who spend all their time drinking the wine and living the luxurious life of security that the church offered. And there are the three good monks, a little bit resentful of these monks who were having a party time. So, that's the picture of the medieval world, expressed in as few pictures as possible. And I'll carry on next time and show the Protestant Revolution.